Hello, and welcome to this talk about Weimerica. I'm here with Ryan Landry and Anti-Dem, and we're going to discuss that concept and how the situation is developing. Particularly, it's apt that this was scheduled for today since, given the events in Chicago with Trump and Black Lives Matter. But before we get to that, I'll ask each of you to introduce yourselves. Ryan, please.
I'm Ryan Landry. I host my own podcast called Weimerica Weekly, where I try to tackle one topic that fits within the tapestry of modern America, being a parallel or an echo of the Weimar Republic.
Okay. And Anti-Dem.
Hey, everybody. I'm Anti-Dem. Find me at antidem.wordpress.com or askfm/Anti-Dem. And I'm super happy to be here with Ryan Landry, who is our expert on the subject of Weimerica. Been a fan of his for a long time, and I'm especially happy to be on with him because he is the son of Brock Lesnar.
Okay, I don't know who Brock Lesnar is, but I'm just going to go ahead. Now, should I say Weimerica or Weimerica?
It doesn't matter to me.
No, okay. I just don't want to offend you because you've obviously popularized the concept. So do you want to explain to people briefly, because they might not have read your material before, can you explain briefly what, or in as much depth as you like, what Weimerica is?
Weimerica is a concept that I came up with just examining what was going on in the more social and cultural aspects of 21st century America. And it really struck me in that 2008 to 2012 push for what they called gay marriage. And that within it was this celebration and this acceptance that is suddenly the most holy thing, and that it was an elevation. And when I was looking at American society, I started to take a look at just the other things that were out there, because it seemed like as if the gay marriage issue is being used as more of a vanguard. And there were other things out there. And part of it was having younger relatives who were in college at the time saying, yeah, there's a push for gay marriage. You won't believe what they're talking about in academia. You don't believe this trans issue and poly and all this other stuff. And when I looked at it in America, it was this absolute celebration. It was like, this is the greatest thing. And there was also this element of Americans viewing it as if they were the first, and they were the first people to do it. And when you started looking at the little things technologically, whether it's prostitution on the internet, Tinder, the gay marriage stuff, I started to look at other periods and where other cultures and societies were, I don't want to say near the end, but facing a decadent era and a degenerate era maybe. And one that really struck me, it was Weimar Germany and the Weimar Republic, the interwar years in Germany. And I had taken a couple German history classes, so I knew a little bit about the era, but when I looked a little deeper into the darker side of it, there were so many things that were incredibly similar. And it wasn't just from a sexual standpoint, while I do focus on that because it seems like every few months there's a new oddity that the media is pushing as cool and should be accepted. There was the ability of using media and what we call Hollywood, but film, cinema, to push social issues that would become legislation. There was also issues within just prostitution, the gender relations, the collapsing birth rate. And I don't want to go into too much detail, but one thing that I would say a lot of folks don't realize is that the German fertility rate throughout the Weimar Republic, it collapsed. And it dropped below 2.0 at the very end of the Republic. And immediately, once the Nazis took power, the birth rate popped right back up to replacement level to 2.0. So there was something going on that was striking at the heart of it.
Hold on. What was it at its lowest?
Okay, in the Weimar Republic, it dropped down to like 1.6 in the early 30s. The irony being that for the last 25, 30 years, the German fertility rate's been below that steadily.
Yeah. Okay, well, it might actually be interesting to discuss Weimar Germany in terms of, well, the things about it. If we just speak about that in and of itself, tell me the things about it that you think are relevant now to Weimarica.
A thing that's relevant, and not just say on gender or gender politics, but one thing that I would say the Trump rally is bringing to the forefront was in the Weimar Republic, democracy was a very new thing. Even their version of the pundits, their intelligentsia, they were all happy that the Kaiser was gone, but they didn't truly know how to do any kind of statecraft or governance. And their democracy was a full-blown, as long as you got some signatures and got a bare minimum of voters to support you, you got representation in parliament. So it made crafting legislation, crafting coalitions very difficult. And you had the arguments and the campaigning became marches in the streets, demonstrations, became brawls. And that's what you're seeing right now, where there's always the mention of brown shirts and Trump and the Fuhrer, where in reality the folks who are taking it to a violent step are now in modern America on the left. But whether it's this issue of fighting in the streets, like last night, and there was someone I know who was at the Trump rally and said that there were fights all over the place and the police did a great job of subduing the crowd. But if you look at, say, Black Lives Matter, where it's just an odd expression of frustration, and it's just a political frustration, it becomes part of the circus and part of the show. And that was what was going on in the Weimar Republic as the German bureaucracy just kept things churning. And there would be just weird coalitions would come together, weird coalitions will fall apart. Governments, no party until the Nazis ever cracked 35% of the vote. They also had the media was always pushing further and further left and trying to drag the population to the left. And I know that even political commentators right now are looking at the Democratic primary session and the fact that white liberals are voting along Sanders, whereas your minorities in America are sticking with Clinton.
I want to keep it with Weimar just now. We'll get onto all the parallels later on. I just want to concentrate on Weimarica for now, if that's possible, because I find that it tends to be a good idea to keep it chronological, if possible. So can you tell me the features of it? Sort of list them. Anything that you feel is relevant.
Well, one big thing that folks know about Weimar Germany is that there was the hyperinflation, and that's all they know. Okay, there was a hyperinflation, and everybody's assets were wiped out. And what they forget in Weimar Germany was that happened very early on in the Republic, and that was basically taken care of by the early 20s. And what that did do was that wiped out a lot of the middle class holdings. It made folks who had foreign holdings, it made the folks who were indebted, they suddenly got a boon, whereas your folks who had savings were wiped out. So there was a huge middle class squeeze. And then they set up social safety nets. So if you were on the lower end of the spectrum, things were hard, but there had been a safety net to catch you. And if you were, say, on the higher end of the spectrum, you usually had some commodities. You had any debt related to your business was suddenly easy to pay off because the inflation. But if you were in the middle, you were feeling the squeeze. And then after the hyperinflation, there was this era, what they called rationalization. And rationalization will sound familiar to modern folks. But the Germans were trying to find as efficient processes as possible. And they borrowed a lot from Henry Ford and the American machine shops to make things as efficient as possible. And what they would tell Germans is, yeah, we're not going to give you a raise, and we're going to work you a little harder, but there's 25% of the population is out of work. We don't need you. We can replace you easily. And if you look at modern America, that's a very similar thing with our unemployment rate, how many people are out of work. There's always that threat that you might lose your job. Getting back on the track is difficult. Corporations and employers are working you down to the bone. That's basically what happened with Germany. And there was a huge, huge resentment from the middle, which is where, in the end, a lot of the Nazis got their support was from that working class. I mean, after all, they were the National Socialist Workers' Party.
Yes, indeed. Well, Antidem, is there anything that you'd like to put in at this point?
Well, first, I'm depressed that nobody got my Brock Landers, Brock Lesnar pun. Am I the only person who watches wrestling around here?
Probably.
Yeah, I haven't watched since Kurt Angle was wrestling.
All right. Well, one thing about the Weimar Republic that always occurred to me was that I think we take away all the wrong lessons from the rise of Hitler. The left, for obvious reasons, will tell us that any expression of any kind of genuine rightism is literally Hitler, and anyone who, expresses any sort of rightism or any deviation from just sort of the globalist Davos man, norms is literally Hitler. But I think the lesson is the opposite. I think that what happened was during the Weimar Republic, there were tough decisions that needed to be made. There were things that needed to happen that were kind of nasty. For example, cutting off the absolutely rapacious war reparations that Britain and France demanded and made further demands as their economies worsened in the early stages of the Great Depression. And the Weimar Republic really needed to stand up and tell some people no and grow a backbone, and they didn't. And the thing is, there's, as much as I hate to make a movie reference, there's that scene in The Dark Knight where Alfred talks about the Joker, and he talks about how, the Batman has the local gangsters running scared, and in their desperation, they turn to a man who they didn't fully understand. And that's really a great explanation of Hitler. It's if the government in power at the time, if the responsible people aren't willing to make the tough decisions that are going to make some people angry, well, if those decisions are inevitable, then eventually the people are going to turn to someone who is going to do those things. And it may be someone who they don't fully understand. Now, obviously the Trump is Hitler comparisons are silly, but when we look back at how the Weimar Republic ended, it really ended because the quote unquote responsible people just weren't willing to have a backbone, they were afraid of being called extremists. They were afraid of being called, brinksmen and warmongers. And so they didn't do what needed to be done, to the point where the person who was willing to do what needed to be done appeared on the scene. And, we all know how that went.
If I could jump in, you bring up a good point, because I think a lesson that is lost in looking at that period is that, and part of it is because academics and the media today do not want to ever admit their culpability in anything. So they'll look at that era, and nobody will admit that the media of that era was pushing completely deviant lifestyles. I mean, the clubs that they had there were just as bad as clubs you have of today. I mean, Marlene Dietrich copied her entire gender-bending mannish wardrobe. She copied that off of this short, very ugly lesbian who had a popular radio show. And Dietrich just stole it from her, full force, and was more attractive and therefore became a star. The other thing, too, is that, and this is something that Goebbels actually pointed out, was that he could point to the cities, and I think urbanization that happened throughout the late 19th century in Germany and then early 20th century, urbanization created these playgrounds where folks on the right could point out the absolute hedonism that was going on in some specific cities and go, they would equate them to non-productive citizens and folks who were playing in a playground. And they could also point out whether it was homosexuality or androgynous women or women who were going into the workforce and saying, these people are not contributing to society. They're not having children. They're not building towards the German state. They don't care about the state. So they could always point out to them and then say to these folks, you resent being used. You resent working hard. And that's something that when we look back on it, people forget that there was in the 20s, there was a huge release of tension from the pre-World War I era that a lot of the gender relations did soften. I know Stefan Zweig has commented on that. And one thing I pointed out before is that condoms, the latex condom was finally manufactured in Germany, and that changed relations as well.
Well, yeah, one of the things that had to happen is someone needed to do something to rein in the degenerate excesses of Weimar Berlin. That was another thing that was unsustainable then, and it's unsustainable now. And the Weimar Republic just wasn't willing or able to do it. So finally someone did. And it should be pointed out too, on the other side of things, Moscow in the 1920s was full of sort of libertines and degenerates, and the early part of the communist rule there was full of all kinds of quote unquote free thinkers of that sort. And it was really Stalin who put an end to those people. Most of the Stalinist purges were directed against people who were some manner or another of communist or leftist, but just weren't of the sort that Stalin approved of. And he really sort of righted the ship, because even he understood that the spread of degeneracy throughout his country was going to absolutely doom this, industrial socialist dream that he had.
Right. So it's so interesting just to listen to the two of you. I'm not quite sure what to say. Well, okay. So what, in terms of, all right, let's move forward to Weimarica. When would you say, Ryan, that this decline began? Or is it something that has been going on since World War II?
That's a great question, and one that I try to touch to say to folks that what's the pushes that go on now were tried before. A lot of the push towards homosexuality and accepting homosexuality and even accepting pedophilia were tried in the late 60s and 70s. One thing that threw a curveball, and I think without it, we would be having these social conversations, say 20 years ago. One thing that threw a curveball was HIV/AIDS. I think that without HIV/AIDS, we probably would have seen the push for mainstreaming homosexuality and now the other things that are happening. We probably would have seen it 20, 25 years ago. So if I were to say when homosexuality, when all the odd stuff started to get a solid push, I like to go back to the mid-90s. And that was when the antiretroviral AIDS medications started to stop AIDS deaths in their tracks. And one thing to keep in mind is if you look at in America, the deaths from AIDS, they basically skyrocket on an exponential pattern right in through the early 90s. And then they stop and plateau in the mid 90s. And some of that was from finally there was enough of a critical mass for education in the homosexual community. But the other part of it was that those antiretroviral medications, the AIDS cocktail, as it's called, those were working amazingly well. So AIDS went from being a death sentence that the moment you got HIV, I believe in the famous Liberace's after his death, there was a settlement that happened, and they did a calculation. They said the average person who gets HIV is dead from AIDS in 3 years. That changed, and with those medications, you could manage the disease and live longer. And once that happened, I think that people stopped being completely scared of HIV/AIDS, and I say that as someone who's a teenager in the 90s, where it went from the education system and even Hollywood movies constantly throwing these moms who would catch HIV/AIDS somehow. But the education system went from scaring you to death that, you kiss a girl in the back of a car at age 15, you might get HIV. You better talk to her about everybody you've kissed before. And then we had this weird let's roll that happened in the late 90s. I would say even from women's fashion, where women went from that layering on, hiding with big sweaters, the grungy stuff, to late 90s, they started dressing like hookers again. And I think from there, it's just kind of steamrolled.
I don't know. I kind of see another relationship between HIV/AIDS and sort of the gay rights push. If you look at it, anyone who causes huge problems in American society ends up getting rewarded for it, because there's always a way to turn them into the victim, through just massively irresponsible sexual behavior. Gays ended up playing a huge part in spreading an epidemic that killed millions of people around the world, and they get rewarded for it with gay marriage. Same thing, Muslims, take down the Twin Towers and get rewarded by having their numbers in this country doubled through immigration over the 15 years that follow it. We have this thing of, if you cause some serious problem, there's some way that, not only is it not your fault, but it's the fault of the mainstream for not tolerating you enough, and therefore you need more goodies.
I'm going to disagree slightly, because I think if HIV/AIDS had been started by straight white men, they would be demonized. I think that's just because gays were on the left already.
Well, yeah, obviously, the bad guy in the current narrative is, the straight white male and Christianity, and nothing they do is ever good. Certainly nothing they ever do is good enough. I mean, look at what's just happened with Hillary Clinton issuing some sort of, generic statement of nice things about Nancy Reagan, with her just having passed, and having had to retract it because a bunch of pissed off gay activists, brought back the whole line about how somehow AIDS was Ronald Reagan's fault.
Yeah, that is shocking. And that's something that's especially shocking when you look at the 80s. I once wrote a post on the hidden history of the attempts to close gay bathhouses in the 80s and what gays said. And there was a slogan that the gays said, "Bathhouses now, ovens tomorrow." And there was this fear, and the gays fought. They said that it was their right to have the bathhouses open. And even in, I think it was 84 or 85, only about 500 people had died from AIDS at that point. So to say that Reagan, didn't care, I mean, part of it was that it was a technically an unknown, and then it was tough to get a handle on identifying the disease, figuring out the disease vector. And a lot of the researchers, I mean, they're not going to lay that at Reagan's feet. They lay it at the feet of, it was difficult to track down, difficult to figure out if it was a disease or environmental. And then once they figured out the vector, there were, San Francisco tried to close down bathhouses, New York, LA. I cited a article from 1989. This is not 79, 1989. They talked to Los Angeles bathhouse operators, and they said, well, are you going to close down? And the bathhouse operators go, if we thought it was causing people to get sick, we would. And they didn't. So as you said, Reagan's now the boogeyman. But I think folks have written on, there was some faulty blood transfusion use from Haitian donors in South Florida. And that's what got a lot of the hemophiliacs sick. And then there was just the gay disease vector that happened because of bathhouses. I mean, it's a rewriting of history. And, as you mentioned, it's, they became a victim, and we live in a victim culture. So therefore they had some kind of moral authority.
Right. Well, whatever the narrative is, the narrative is predictable. It's always, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys. It's, it's no different from Star Wars, where, you can tell who the good guys and the bad guys are just by looking at them. And, somehow the story always, history always comes to support the narrative, whether that was real history or not. And, of course, in this case, Reagan, if you look at HIV/AIDS and the number of people it killed and the culpability of those people in their own sickness, and compare it to something like breast cancer, if you don't devote more money to fighting what is basically a voluntary disease that's caught through irresponsible behavior than you do to, some poor women out there who, through no fault of their own, ended up with something like breast cancer. If you don't put the irresponsible people first and spend more money on them, then you hate gays and you're Hitler and it's the ovens next.
Something that I would like to ask, because so much of this seems to revolve around, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here. I want to hear your perspectives on this. Why is it that the destruction of a society, or the projected, what we expect to be the destruction of a society, manifests or even is controlled, created, caused by the destruction of sexual morals? Ryan, could you go first on that?
That's a great question, and it's something that I've seen because, as somebody pointed out, the Marquis de Sade, where we get the term, a sadist, and sadomasochism. He was well known in the upper ranks, and he was a published author in at the end of the ancient regime before the French Revolution. I think that there's something to the notion, and I was raised Catholic, but I think there's something to the notion of, once you've divorced sex from procreation, then you're going to, that caused the generation gap of the 60s, really. You're going to lose pair bonding, the idea that you're going to have few partners. So the partner you do have, you create a pair bond with, it'll be it's more positive relationship. There are those studies, those surveys that show that women who have fewer sexual partners have much more lasting marriages. And I think that somebody else mentioned to me that was like the pill, because they said, there's the barbarian hordes that took down the Roman Empire. And they said that our barbarian hordes was the pill, because once we gave everybody that power of figuring out what they wanted to do sexually and having total control if they wanted to, once we divorced that connection of procreation and sex, marriage and sex, then it was kind of a free-for-all of experimentation. And then, as you mentioned, that loosening of morals, you start going down the path of, you seek more experiences. There's that hedonism. You're going for the thrill. And at what point does it go from fun experimentation to, you're deep dark in an S&M club in Berlin, having a woman stomp on your balls with heels? And I've heard those stories. I mean, I had a friend who told me about a night at different sex clubs in Berlin in 2001, and it blew my mind. But, I can kind of see it now, as I'm older, and I can look back on it and go, once you start chasing that thrill and you've divorced it completely from creating a family, you'll chase it more. And then on top of that, if you're not creating families, if your fertility rate's going down, if you're not marrying, you lose a connection to, one, building a future, and then maintaining resources for a future. So you just start consuming resources for today. So your time horizons just shorten up.
Yeah, well, one thing certainly is, you get inured to something, you get jaded, and your future hits need to be bigger doses of harder drugs. If you look back on, what was literally illegal. What got Irving Klaw thrown in jail in the 50s were these, relatively, by our standards, completely innocuous, pictures of Betty Page, mostly in bikinis, occasionally topless. Then you go forward through, Playboy didn't even publish full nudity until 1972. And now, oddly enough, it's decided not to publish nudity at all. But that's, that's it getting eaten by the monsters that it unleashed. What we've got for pornography now, not only in its availability at the end of a keystroke, but just in what's available out there is just, shocking even to me, and I'm pretty jaded. But, where do you even go from here? I shudder to think.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I think that something Ryan said there was very interesting, that basically people's time horizons shrink, because if you're encouraging them just to indulge themselves, and of course there's another prong to it as well, isn't there, that it becomes self-obsession rather than outward looking. It becomes narcissism. You encourage narcissism if you encourage sexual promiscuity.
By the way, one thing to notice, the left really doesn't have any principles, only ideology. Look at their attitude towards free speech, which has, quote unquote, evolved. Even 15 years ago, the fact that the Dixie Chicks didn't get a record contract renewed because they didn't like George W. Bush. Oh my gosh, this is censorship. This is the end of free speech. This is awful. And look at that compared to their attitudes now. Well, you'll notice that the only freedoms that they have always consistently championed, the only rights that they have always been behind 100% of the time, are sexual freedoms. It's always, gay rights, abortion, contraception. That's the only thing that they are always consistent on supporting. And, that's something they even ask leftists, okay, since Barack Obama got elected, what civil rights have you supported that aren't in some way related to sex? And, you'll leave them with their mouths gaping because there aren't any.
That's a great point, and one that I would say goes back to a chaos thing. Left is for chaos, right is for order. Once you give people that power, there are folks who are, higher functioning, higher cognitive abilities that could handle that power of, I can control when I'm going to have children. I can make that decision. I'm forward thinking. I have a good, time horizons. I'm a case selection person. But then for most folks, it doesn't work. And one thing I've noticed is that the left has shifted in their idea of, you provide a social safety net, you provide all these Planned Parenthood things because, it's a woman's thing, and let's help the poor and destitute. It's now shifted to, well, life happens. These two people were dating for 6 months. Oh, and then a life comes along. And the reason for that is the chaos that comes there is that suddenly you have one, probably a new voter, two, somebody who's going to have to use social services, somebody's going to have a solution provided by government. So it kind of becomes something they want. One question I had for Millennial Woes is, are you Scottish or English?
Scottish.
Okay, because one thing for me is I always kind of view, since I was in college and I went and I lived in England for 6 months, I viewed England as kind of a forerunner for where America's going. And the thing that I was stunned about when I lived there was how flippant British women were with their sexuality. And they would even talk about like how many times you get to use the morning after pill, or one girl let her friend use one of her times. It blew my mind, the behavior there. And then it seemed like it took Americans, I don't know if it was just some residual Puritan thing, or we're a little bit maybe more Christian, if that has some kind of hangover effect. But the attitudes I saw in like 2000, 2001 from England, I saw in, say, 2005, 2006 from American women.
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, yeah, I don't know. That's difficult to say. I think, I think that there probably was a sort of lingering gracefulness in American women up until about 10 years ago, which had already been in England and certainly Scotland had already gone the way of the dodo many years before. I'm afraid. But I don't know why that would be. I think maybe, yes, religiosity, or maybe just, I mean, my first thought would be simply that America was successful, was on top of the world more recently than Britain was. So it had that lingering sort of energy and confidence, belief in itself from the 1950s, whereas for Britain, that would be the 1900s.
By the way, one thing about sex is, let's remember that, the Christian attitude towards sex is that sex and the desire for it are a powerful force of nature. And, just like fire is a powerful force of nature. And fire can be the best thing in the world or the worst thing in the world. If you properly control it, if you keep it within reasonable boundaries, it's a benefit to you. It'll cook your food so you don't get sick. It'll keep you warm on a winter's night. But if it gets out of control, it's going to burn down the forest you live in and you with it. So, sex is a powerful force of nature, and it needs to be kept within certain boundaries to keep it still a beneficial thing instead of being something that's just a ruination to your society. That the left takes these things, properly kept within its proper boundaries. Sex is family. Sex is marriage. Sex is children. Sex is, everything about keeping your society going in a straight line, keeping it successful and keeping it pro-social. But, if you pervert that, if you let that out of its boundaries, then, you're going to get where we are with the forest burning down around us.
One thing that's another parallel between Weimar Germany and modern America was just this week, I saw somebody shared it online that said, and they were talking about the rise of those sugar daddy websites, girls on Tinder kind of being not maybe professional hookers, but kind of accepting some money, that said that there was a new survey that showed like 1 in 6 Americans had accepted money in exchange for sex. And I mean, that's a staggering number. I mean, 1 in 6, I mean, you're almost at 20% of America. And that was something that in the Weimar Republic, there were legal, prostitution was legal for these specific women who were called control girls. And they were legal prostitutes. They were checked regularly for venereal diseases. But then there were a lot of women that were working as prostitutes who were either students, they were part-time workers, or they were women who were 9 to 5 girls. And once work was done, they might have a date set up. They might be a professional like once or twice a week. So there was a lot of informal prostitution, which kind of, we see an echo of that today with the women who are, doing God knows what through the variety of online services. But then the folks who are doing the sugar daddy arrangement, the girls who are in college, and I know there were multiple articles written about the women in college who are being set up with older men in this disgusting, transfer of wealth from older man to a college girl that goes right to pay off her student debts that, she can't release in any kind of bankruptcy. So that's a weird parallel that's propped up now, where the formal and informal prostitution network that's much more widespread.
Well, anything that is not sacred will become commoditized. And sex has become commoditized either through a formal exchange of money, just in outright prostitution, or something like Tinder, where it's just, commoditized in the sense that any cheap commodity is readily available. Commoditized in the sense that the cheap made in China junk at Walmart or the dollar store is commoditized. It's just so common you don't even need to think about acquiring it. And that cheapens it so much. I mean, as I feel so bad for women. I mean, they can't be happy with this, and I know they're not. But we just don't know how to put things back together into any kind of normal order again.
Whenever I see Woes' name, I always think that that'd be a great title to a song or a book, because I'm a very young Gen Xer, but I have multiple cousins who are millennials, and when I think millennial woes, like when they complain about the social thing, one that they often say, and this is my male cousins, they'll go, "Man, I can get laid tonight. I can go on Tinder. I can get laid tonight. Having sex is easy." I I got some overweight cousins who even say that, and they go, "Yeah, I can get laid tonight, but to have a girl stay longer than 3 weeks, that's nearly impossible." And for them, like you mentioned, it commoditizes things. It turns sex into a transactional, sex and romance turns into a transactional thing, where you go through the ritual of finding somebody on Tinder or meeting somebody at a party or a bar. And that doesn't happen that much now, but you meet somebody at a bar, you meet somebody on Tinder, you go through the ritual, you punch the buttons, how you're going to get the lay. And then that cycle starts all over. There's no, forget courtship, but the romance is taken out of it. The personal, whether it's a spiritual thing or that spark, the spark you can get from between two people that's beyond just pure lust, but what ends up becoming mutual attraction and developing love. It's not love at first sight, but the idea of building love, that seems like something gone. And I hear my cousins who are 24, 27, 29, they lament it. And they say to me, they go, "Man, you got married at my age. I can't even find a girl who can stay longer than 2 weeks." And it's something that they lament. And I think of an entire generation growing up, not like the lost generation from the 1920s, but almost like a lost romantic generation.
Well, that's very Brave New World. I mean, that this idea that sex is endlessly easy to get, but there is no human connection between anybody. And, Brave New World was written in, I think 1936, which means that the idea for it probably started ruminating in Huxley's brain, maybe during the late Weimar Republic.
I'm sure it would be.
Yeah. This is where we've gotten to. It's like those things you read about, the cuddle parties that people are having, where it's just, they just want some human contact. Some actual connection with people. And sex is so divorced from that these days that, it's almost a completely separate idea.
I saw this thing on YouTube, some woman who is a type of prostitute, but all she does is cuddle them. She just cuddles her clients. And I thought, that's amazing that you have to pay for that.
Well, there are some.
It's such a shame.
There are some prostitutes who offer what's called the girlfriend experience, where they will actually pretend to be your girlfriend for, a day, which, culminates in sex, but they'll, the kicker, the thing you're really paying high dollars for, is they'll actually pretend to like you for a while.
Yeah, I think that goes even more demented. And there was in the whole girlfriend experience, because there was an article, I can't remember if Esquire or Vanity Fair or New Yorker ran it, that talked about high-end escorts. I think it was maybe 2 years ago. And it mentioned how they were, that these higher-end escorts were, they were studying their languages, they were staying on top of current events, they were learning how to cook. And they would talk about that, when I see my clients, because it's always clients, because it's a transactional, issue. When I see my clients, I might offer them something to eat. I make sure that I know what's going on. If he does business in China, I make sure I know what's going on in China. It was mind-blowing. And what was mind-blowing was that these men were single men paying for it because they had turned what normal folks would turn, normal folks would have a relationship, might have a real girlfriend or might have a wife. And for them, it was what modern women offer now. There's no incentive for them to bone up, for them to study up and to know how to cook. I mean, my male cousins who are in their 20s, my mom had come out to visit and she was teasing them and she was like, why don't you find a good girl, blah, blah. And my cousin goes, there are no good girls left. Define a good girl. And my mom listed, 4 or 5 things. And my cousin goes, I date pretty girls and I date attractive women. I can't tell you the last time I met a girl who knew how to cook beyond eggs and a grilled cheese sandwich. And it shocked my mom to hear, but part of it is, and this is another thing about Weimar, is we're very atomized. We're very atomized with our existence, where boomers will not understand what millennials will go through, and millennials will not understand what boomers retiring or whatever go through. Nobody has a clue what's going on. Part of that is they've made us really good narcissists. So we're only focused on our lives and people like us. But the other thing is that we can be segregated. Auntie Dem, you mentioned what's available for pornography out there. I was joking with my mom and dad. They came out to visit, and my wife and I were saying, yeah, we're fine if they invent sex robots in the next 5 or 6 years, because we'll get one for my son and we'll make sure that, we're going to cut the internet off. And my parents were laughing. And I said, well, there's only so much that a 13-year-old boy can imagine, but the internet will show him every source of filth. So my parents were like, what are you talking about? So I just went and typed, like you said, at your fingertips. I typed in just a basic tube site, and I just flashed it right over to them. And I said, look at these images. And these are all videos. And this is all on demand. And it horrified my parents, because I think my parents were under the assumption that it was still like 1970s Playboy and the voyeuristic, what the butler saw pornography, but it's not. It's completely barbaric.
Well, the thing about good women really sort of ties into, and I've got a blog post sort of in the back of my mind about this, both the waifu phenomenon and the My Little Pony brony phenomenon. Because, we've gotten to a point where women who actually, have decent personalities and act in a way that appeal to men, beyond just offering them, a hole to ejaculate into, where that's so hard to find that stronger connections are made with, blots of ink on celluloid than on flesh and blood women. And for an understandable reason. I'm not saying I approve of it. Anime fan that I am, I'm not, I can't approve of that. But at the same time, if you've ever actually watched My Little Pony Friendship is Magic, I know why people like it. The characters in that are just nice women. I mean, yeah, I mean, they're ponies, but, we're talking personality-wise. They're not perfect, but, they're nice people. They're understanding. They're the sort of personalities that you could easily get along with. They're not in competition with you. They're not ready to jump down your throat. They don't have a chip on their shoulder because, years worth of the media or their professors at college have told them that you're their enemy. And I understand the appeal of really forming a connection with that. What we don't ask ourselves, it's easy to look at men who fall into that and call them a bunch of autistic goobers. And maybe to some degree they are, but we should also be asking ourselves, how did women become so unappealing as anything other than sex objects? And hey, wait a second, I thought that was supposed to be what feminism was all about, was making women something other than sex objects. How did women get to the point where they're unappealing enough that you have dudes falling in love with cartoon ponies instead of them?
There's something, and this goes back to when I was asked if he was Scottish or English. When I was in England, and I think this hits in with the idea of good women. When I was in England, studying in England, there were in our program, we were not in London, and I wanted the real English experience. So I went to a school outside of London, and there were only about 50 Americans in the program at the university out of the thousands upon thousands of students. And the funny thing was, all the American guys could get laid. The American women, 1 out of the 20-something ever hooked up with a guy. And the constant complaint, the British guys would say, why do they always want to be your pal? Why do they always want to be your buddy? And they'd be like, oh, they want to be your friend. Why do they want to joke around with you? I don't care. And they were these wonderfully proper guys who would say, when a British girl is being friendly and giving me a couple of signs, I know it's a done deal. They're like, but your American girls, it's friendly, crack a few jokes, punch me on the shoulder. And they'd say, some of these girls are really attractive. We'd want to hook up with them. But it's this weird, they were friend zoning, every single British guy they met. And a lot of these guys were, young, attractive guys. And it was something there about they were already having, while they were feminine and still attractive young women, they were already having that feminine companionship stripped from them and trying to do as you mentioned, Nancy, that competition, that I'm your buddy, I'm your pal, the ball buster, that kind of description of what they are. That was already creeping in. And I mean, it's only gone to the nth degree now, where women act like men in 2016.
Yeah, in the current year. Fred Reed's written about this a lot, which is, young women get these horrible signals. And again, it has to be making them miserable. I know it's making them miserable. I know that they can't figure out what they're supposed to be because everything they get from, television, which has become our substitute for reality, to what they learn in college, to what they learn from the people around them who form a huge echo chamber, are telling them to be something they know somehow deep down is just wrong. But again, we've lost the ability to know how to do anything better.
Well, okay. A lot of it is atomization, isn't it? I mean, I've been writing down some notes here, and after this, I think we should move away from the sexual stuff towards the more the other stuff. Now, here are some notes that I've taken down. Because I want to get to the bottom of why this is that unleashing sexual appetites leads to, it has terrible effects on society. So here are some of the terrible effects that I've thought of. Narcissism, self-absorption. It reduces time horizons. It results in alienation, atomization. It's an easy way to make people degrade themselves and lose that sense of sanctity. It's the most personal. Sexual morality is the most personal type of morality, and I think that these are just ideas. If either of you want to disagree with these please do. But I've said that sexual morality is the most personal type, and what I mean by that is that it's the type of morality which you find most. It's the type of morality that you care about most because it reflects most on you. Like if you do something degrading, really deeply that you've done something degrading, and it seems to say a lot about you. Whereas, if you steal something from a shop, you can say to yourself, well, it doesn't really matter that much. But there's something sacred about sex and intimacy that you're violating. And I think that when society encourages people to do, promiscuity and things like that, it is attacking this sense of the sacred, and thus attacking people's view of themselves.
I also think it gets to the idea of the status games, because I mean, if some folks will say we're into a post-scarcity economy, and folks just care about what their status is, and they won't use goods to judge status. A lot of folks are so defensive about what their status is. So part of it becomes, say you're into BDSM, but you're gay, but then you're trans. If you're cool with my stuff, I'm cool with your stuff. I won't look down on you if you don't look down on me. And as you mentioned, because it is so personal, because it lingers with you forever. I mean, think about the things that get unearthed about different public figures, and that which they're trying to whether hide, or keep in the closet, or just keep on the down low, don't reveal until later. I mean, I think the actor, was it Richard Chamberlain or whatever, British actor, came out of the closet just a couple of years ago, and he was like 82 or 81. It's like, or Joel Gray. It's like, why were you hiding it? But there's still something so personal, as you mentioned. It's just so personal that we will defend it.
Well, that's why I think the first thing that they tend to go for is legalizing abortion, because that is such an obvious horror. That is so obviously wrong and unnatural that if they can get you to do that, if they can get you to murder your own children as a sacrifice to Moloch, then what can't they get you to do?
Yeah. Well, the type of what I was thinking of is that when you get a woman, when you persuade her to sleep around, then you've fundamentally altered her notion of herself. I mean, it's completely different from the way women viewed themselves 50 years ago. And I think it's crucial. I think it's key to female psychology that they have to see their sexuality and their sexual offering as something very expensive. And so if you persuade them to make it something very cheap, that throws everything off kilter.
Yeah.
Hello?
And sorry, I stepped on you.
Okay. Right.
I was going to say I'll take the flip side of it too, because it's not just a female thing. I think that in the modern Western world, we've devalued or destroyed the value of so many masculine traits for men in ways that men could compete with one another. There's the idea that, what do you work out a lot? What are you insecure about? Or if you work a lot to provide for your family, or just to make a lot of money, you're a workaholic. There's so many things that we don't allow men to compete on. But the one thing that it's okay for men to be super manly about, is to be a total Romeo, to sleep around a lot. So you get men competing on that and that alone.
Yeah, well, that sort of goes in with what I was going to say about how we've taken the sacred thing of sexuality, sacred in that our traditions, our religion made it sacred so that they could put certain necessary limits about it so that it didn't get out of hand. We've taken that and subjected it to the brutal forces of the marketplace. That's what's commoditized it. And it's what's ended up with the phenomenon of, relatively few alphas getting a whole lot of pussy and, a whole lot of non-alphas, sitting at home beating their baloney while they think of Rainbow Dash.
Right. I wouldn't ask what Rainbow Dash is. Is it one of these My Little Pony things?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't get these references. Sorry.
Okay. Well, okay. And the other thing I wanted to say was, it slackening sexual morals destroys romance, leading to scientism and nihilism. Now, these are just ideas that I'm putting out. I think if you get rid of romance, I don't just mean romance between a man and woman. I mean romance in the very general sense. If you encourage someone to just see themselves as an animal, a sort of fuck machine, then it's very difficult for them to have a romantic view of life in general. And I think the result of it is this awful scientism that I see on Facebook among young people, and nihilism. I think those two are the two sides of the same coin. A world without romance is going to be a world of cold scientism and cold nihilism. That's the way I see it.
That's a good view. I mean, a purely materialistic view of the world. Kind of demystify the world, if you will. That's a good point.
Thank you. Go on.
That is, Brave New World. It's everything is practical. Everything is materialistic. Everything is capitalistic. Everything is, building better cogs for bigger machines. and there's nothing human about it. I see that stunned everyone.
Sorry, no, I didn't realize I'd muted myself again.
You were still thinking of Rainbow Dash, weren't you?
No, I wasn't. I'd actually forgotten all about it already. Sorry. I will Google it afterwards, I promise. Okay, so can we move this on then to... I was hoping to get to the thing in Chicago with Trump, but Ryan, would you like to sort of broaden this out from sexual morality to, again, back to the concept of Weimarica?
I mean, for me, it's when I looked at a lot of things in Weimar, between what you had in Antidem brought it up about abortion was something that was pushed in the Weimar Republic for let's make this legal. And this was something that they used their cinema to push it. There was a film that was titled, I believe, Sündig Mother. I can't remember what the translation is for that. There was another one called Women's Crusade, where there was an abortion doctor, and it stressed the need that there should be abortion reform. And that was a push. You had the push to make prostitution fully legal, pull the restraints from it, and then you had all the assorted nightclubs. And if an American even knows of the Weimar era, they know it from the film Cabaret.
Cabaret, yeah.
And that's kind of a funny view of it, because Cabaret is a little, I would say, it's a little realistic of what was going on in those clubs. Men dressed as women, God knows what relationships going on, the very loose morality. It still isn't even close to how seedy some of the clubs were, or how seedy some of the arrangements were. But those issues are just something that I see today, where there's so many things that get uncovered, whether it's on the internet, whether it's new apps, and it creates things that are transactional. But it just goes to a general free-for-all, like as you mentioned, just kind of a hedonistic nihilism, where it's like, who cares? We're just going for the thrill of today.
Yeah.
Speaking of cinema, it just brought something to mind. There was a movie in 1966 called Alfie, starring Michael Caine. And basically in this movie, Michael Caine's character is sort of this Lothario who, beds all kind of women. And somewhere in the course of the film, he gets one of them pregnant. And this woman goes on with his knowledge to have what is at that point an illegal abortion. And there's a scene in this movie where, basically the aborted fetus is sitting in this bucket, and he goes over and he looks down into the bucket and he sees, this broken, aborted body of his child. And it shocks him into repentance. He goes forward and changes everything about his ways. Well, that was 1966's version of it. The movie was remade in 2004 with Jude Law. And in this version, again, he gets her pregnant and she just goes someplace and has an abortion and no big deal. And we just move on with the plot. And this whole idea of it shocking this character into changing himself, just out the window. And that shows, the quote unquote progress of almost 30 years.
That's very interesting. That's a really interesting comparison. Well, Ryan, would you like to, as I say, broaden this from sexual morality to the concept of Weimarica? Because what you're talking about is America in decline. You're talking about the end of an empire, a civilization.
Yeah, it's. I would say it's our decadent phase, and a big thing in a decadent phase is that there's the vitalism. You start doing things just for the thrill, and that is something that I would say you can see it just on basic folks. Where why are they really doing this? Why are they really? I mean, Tumblr is just a depository of filth, but it's also a depository of folks who are constantly trying to stress that what they're doing is so amazing and so fulfilling. And it starts at just maybe a tattoo or a funny mohawk that they dye, bright green. And then they go towards just the experience side of, I'm now in a relationship with somebody who's gender fluid, or I'm now the third wheel. I'm the second woman in this married couple's life, and we're all open about it. And then you got folks who are just focused on that, and that's their life. And a lot of times I look at something, if I just cruise through Tumblr for 5 minutes, because I'll take 5 minutes a day just to look for weird things for the Weimarica Instagram. But sometimes I look at things and I go, God, I hope that this is a teenager or a 21 or 22-year-old writing this. But then when I hit the About Me or go to their direct Tumblr, it's somebody in their 30s. And it's this weird, they get trapped like in that total free for all, because you mentioned about like the sexual morality and going towards the decline. It's like adults have the freedom of children now, and that's all they want. They want the freedom for sex, to goof off with their video games or goof off with their getting involved with their little Netflix, what's on their queue. They don't, employment, spotty. Let mom and dad government take care of the big issues. They just want that freedom of no responsibilities, to be able to run around and do whatever the hell they want. So as to go back to something Antidem had said in the beginning, that they're always fighting for sexual rights, but that's maybe all people want. Maybe all people want is that teenage feeling, that magical period when you're in your late teens where you have an adult body, but you have no responsibilities. And people might want that. And that's absolutely no forward thinking, and that does no planning for the long term. And that's where you start getting into that, Nick Land cites a collapse, but you start getting to the point where how fast does the collapse go? Is it a slow motion collapse, or does it start to snowball and, your collapse speeds up just because you get more and more folks who get sucked into that childhood freedom?
Well, leftism really is the political expression of the desire for eternal adolescence. What does it want? It wants consequence-free sex, and it wants somebody else to pay for all the stuff they want. That's really it. It's just a desire to stay 14 forever. And, again, while I understand that, it's a disaster. And we know where this ends. Look, 2,500 years ago in the Republic, Plato told us, where late stage democracy goes. He said, you'd walk around a democracy and, students didn't respect their teachers, children didn't respect their elders, people would walk into, a nice building, with their dogs behind them. It just gets into this idea of license, and social order breaks down. And that's where we're heading. And, from the Spenglerian point of view, this either ends up in a Caesar or it ends up in just dissolution into collapse, where the government sort of becomes these faceless mandarins who just, administer everything as a technocracy. The people slouch into dissolution until, I don't know, until the barbarians literally show up at our door and tell us we're conquered, which frankly is starting to happen. That's what the Trump wall is designed to keep out. And it's what's happening in Europe right now. I mean, literally, we have reached a point where the women of Europe, of Germany, are voting to open up the city gates to let the barbarians in to rape them. That's certainly not a very positive view of women's suffrage, and it's certainly not a very positive view of where we are now in the West as a society.
It's great that you bring up Spengler, because he wrote that his huge work right in the midst of the Weimar Republic. He was looking at the wreckage around him. The post-war wreckage, that the idea that the German Empire after roughly 50 years of, unification had reached for the heights, had been destroyed. There was the shame and the guilt from the war, because that was a big thing from the Treaty of Versailles, was that the Germans had to accept guilt for starting the war, and just them. And that was something that they were not comfortable with, they did not like. So he wrote that book then, and I think there's a website, I can't remember the name of it, but they talked about, there were like 10 specific predictions that Spengler made, or maybe not even specific dates, but he talked about what, say, 100 years or so would look like. And they're not vague terms, but he talks about technologies where you could barely understand what would be happening, that would be not tangible. And I mean, there are certain things that he describes that we've been hitting, like checking off boxes, just click, click, click. For me, I agree with you on the idea of Caesars. I mean, he called them, I think, the Faustian Caesars. They would be Caesars out of the Faustian mode, that we are Faustian Europeans. I see that happening where you are right. There are barbarians who will come, and whether in America it'll be, say, narco cartel barbarians who are going to instill order for their own gain, or Muslim barbarians in Europe, and then likewise, folks who would fight back. I see Caesarism coming, and part of that will be that just our bureaucracy and our current system. You can see it happening now politically, that nothing really happens, but the machinery continues, and the machinery continues for very few folks' benefit. It'll ossify, and you'll see folks who will either make a deal with certain economic elites, or rising newer economic elites will go, we need a new order to make sure things function. And you will see folks call out for that, call out or yearn for a strong man to set things right. I believe France had a survey a couple of years ago, and it was already at 40% of the French people would support a strong man who would who would clean out some laws and set things right. I mean, we're not even halfway through the crisis, and folks are already at that level.
Well, difficult to see the future is, and to me, I'm not sure whether the Caesarist part of the Spenglerian cycle is behind us, if that's what Mussolini and Hitler and Franco represented, and it all fizzled out with the defeat of Hitler after only 12 years in power, or whether, and if that's true, then what's ahead of us is just the rule of mandarins into absolute dissolution and collapse, or whether Caesarism is ahead of us with some unknown person. I mean, certainly that's what I'd like, because, hey, I would love to see an Augustus come in and rejuvenate our society. Trump is...
I was going to say that brings us to Trump. I mean, why is he not Caesar?
I don't think he even wants to be. I mean, he's a businessman, he's a deal maker, and that's all good. But he's not a disruptor. He's not. There's a difference between a reformer and a revolutionary. A reformer wants to change the system in order to save it. A revolutionary wants to tear down the system to establish something else. And although a reformer and a revolutionary may look very similar from sort of a distance, that's a completely different endpoint that they've got. From what I see, Trump isn't Hitler. What he is the current system's last chance. I thought that was Ron Paul in 2008 or 2012, and then Trump sort of came out of nowhere as a black swan to sort of provide the system with its last chance. But, the fear that I have as a reactionary is that what Trump will end up doing as a reformer is he's going to fix a broken and unsustainable and immoral system just enough that he's going to be able to keep it limping on for a few more decades before it collapses and we, go through a bad time but emerge at the end of it with something better, instead of that happening sooner instead of later. If that's what we've got, then he's a net negative. That's what Gorbachev tried to do with the Soviet Union in the 80s. He tried to reform it enough that he could keep that system limping along, and he failed. And, now Russia, I'm a big fan of Vladimir Putin. I'm happy Russia is what it is. I think it's getting better every single day. My fear is that we'll get not a Gorbachev, but a Deng Xiaoping, who decided to reform China's communist system in the late 70s and early 80s. And again, he succeeded just enough to keep that system limping along to the point where China is stuck with this evil, awful government for God knows how much longer.
I see Trump more along those reformer lines, as Anti-Dem said, and I question even. I'm a little bit more sober about Trump. I question, one, if he's even going to receive the nomination. I mean, as we can see, the shenanigans being pulled by the GOP, the math is very tough for him to get a majority of delegates unless he starts sweeping. Now he might, as there's a potential that the wildness that was on TV screens last night and the insanity that the left has, and this is something that's been building up for a while. I mean, these protests have been going on campuses over just insanely stupid reasons. They've been shutting down campuses the last couple of years. Black Lives Matter has been going after the police over silly things, and there's a lot of folks who sit at home and go, yeah, this what are they complaining about now? What are they whining about now? And I mean, you could say the ball got going where, even though they were in power with Occupy Wall Street, some folks on the left started going, we got our boy in, but they're not sending bankers to jail, and the system still is what it is. And so they just kind of do these phony protests, and it might help Trump. He might win the nomination. He might then go on and win the general election. I mean, I think we're seeing right now the GOP establishment and their punditocracy is doing their best to show that they are the outer party. They are requesting help from the inner party to take out this insurgent. And if worse comes to worse and he gets the nomination and they don't feel that they can smoothly and justifiably steal it from him, they're just going to go and support Clinton, put him down, keep the system intact. I think that would also be a precursor for him being in office, where he'd be going up against a bureaucracy that would not support him. He would have to make a lot of friends and a lot of peace and a lot of deals with the national security state. There are a lot of folks who can just gunk up the gears and slow everything down. That's where I don't see him having a lot of success there. I mean, I'd love it if he could just build a wall and deport illegals. That'd be fine enough for me. I don't see him causing much change, and I see the system accelerating towards problems and collapse.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we always know what the solutions are. We know what the solutions are. We just know that they'll never be implemented because there is not the psychological will. There's not that energy to do it. I mean, it's like, the car is fine, the engine works, but there's no petrol in it, so it's not going to move. Even if it could just, it's a kind of futile thing. This is why I agree with, when Richard Spencer says that we need the meta-politics before we can have the politics. I think that's entirely correct. The other day I was watching this video, I can't remember the guy's name, but he was saying that we need to get, he's sort of BNP type guy, and he was saying that what we need to do is get local politics. We need to get politics, people elected who represent us, and enough with the talking and the intellectualizing. And I think absolutely not. It's impossible. You cannot put the cart before the horse like that. And so Trump is a similar thing.
One thing is, there comes a point in the decline of decaying societies where all of the answers are absolutely obvious. We know what we need to do, but the system is just so sclerotic that we can't do them. As Hugo Bardi brought up about in his talk about the Roman Empire, what the Roman Empire needed to do in its very latest stages was absolutely obvious. Stuff like, retreat from the borders, fortify its towns, all of that. And in its own way, that's exactly what ended up happening after Rome's collapse in the Middle Ages. So what happened was what had to happen. It's just they got dragged kicking and screaming into it because they couldn't make the decisions necessary to do it. Well, we all know what America needs to do if it wants to keep surviving. We won't do it. We can't do it because the system is too sclerotic. Now, as to whether Trump could break through that, if anyone can do it, he can. If anyone can do it, big if.
The other thing I'd chip in is that you're right. It is Trump against the system, and if anyone can do it, it's a billionaire with decades of visibility who doesn't owe anything to anyone. I would say that you are right that this system is sclerotic, and just we know what needs to be done. But the other thing to keep in mind is those folks. You have to delegitimize the current institutions, and you have to create separate institutions. The fact that nobody ever gets fired, no matter how wrong they are in the media, no matter how much mayhem they cause, the fact that the New York Times did not fire a single person who pushed the hands up, don't shoot lie, they pushed that for months, and no one lost their job. Enough of people. There's a reason that Trump will say, the media hates you and the media is the worst people in the world, and his crowds go wild because nobody likes the media, but they're in power. And I would say it's that when you take a look at who wins from our current system, we pull in immigrants who are semi-literate, third worlders. They need social services. They're going to use and they're going to consume junk media. And on top of that, they're going to be fools for whatever financial schemes. And they're a new borrower. The borrowing, since we're in a FIRE economy, a finance, insurance, real estate economy, the marginal buyer, the marginal consumer, the marginal retail person, you need a greater fool to sell to increase your asset values. They're always going to want to pull people in. So your current economic elite, that the fact that they're linked to FIRE, that's a problem. We have to shrink that sector back down to just being a part of our economy. And that's where the Trump threat, and that's where when the fact that the Republicans can be debating tariffs, it blew my mind to hear people saying that they were talking about tariffs. We've had almost 40 years of open borders, deregulation, reduced tariffs. We've had that, and we've watched capital leave, we've watched jobs leave. I mean, you're in the UK. I mean, what Thatcher did with the mines in Wales, just close them on down. And there were so many things we did because no, this is free trade and this will be cheaper for us. Now, sure, your toys might be like 50 cents cheaper for your kid's plastic toy because the labor is only worth 10% of the total cost. So your toy's 50 cents cheaper, but suddenly 200 people are out of work in your hometown or in your county. Well, that's horrible. That's a horrible societal trade-off. And so maybe Trump could do something about it, but there are lined up economic interests that make their money off of that enjoy that, and they are entrenched. Once the dollar game is messed with, they will lose their power. And in America, I can't speak for Europe or England, but in America, the only thing keeping our, quote unquote, melting pot together is the fact that people still have a decent purchasing power. If you walk through a mall in a diverse or even semi-diverse area, and you take a look at all those different families from all those different backgrounds, they wouldn't give two shits about each other if suddenly their pocketbooks were on the line. It just would not happen.
And of course, the malls are closing. I wrote a blog post about that not too long ago based on Beckloff's video about his childhood mall being torn down. The Randall Park Mall being torn down, and that's happening all across America. Trump's a smart enough businessman to understand that sending all of our factories to China and then saying we're going to stay prosperous by all selling each other insurance is not something that's going to be sustainable, even if we come along like Obamacare and make it mandatory to buy insurance, it still isn't going to be something that can go on very long.
Well, what I'd like to ask you now is Black Lives Matter and what's happened recently. How does that link with Weimerica, Ryan? Tell me all the ways.
If I were to say that, Black Lives Matter kind of feeds into the street protesting. Like with the Weimar Republic, there were folks, democracy was new to them, but democracy was something that became combative. And it was something that those folks could be out there in the streets. If you got in fights, if you became a victim of something, you became a hero. Part of that was the fact that you had your communists, you had your different forms of socialists, you had your nationalists. You also had a lot of guys who had come back after World War I who had a little bit of taste of blood in their mouth, and they wanted it. In Weimerica, we create these street protesters, and you see these protesters. You can tell a real protest versus the fake protest that's just an arm of the liberal narrative and the liberals. It's how you get your media coverage. Black Lives Matter can burn down their city, and it's an expression. That's political speech. And what that ends up becoming for the left, which has a hard time cobbling a coalition for any legislation, it then becomes a talking point for, well, problems in the Black community, forget all the things that have been done positive for them for the last 50 years. There still needs to be more done. The problems in the Black community, mass incarceration, policing. Why are our local police departments so rough on Black men? There should be federal oversight. And they become similar to the old brown shirts or red shirts or commies in the streets. Black Lives Matter has become Black bodies in the streets who are just the foot soldiers for what ends up becoming legislation. I would look at this whole Black Lives Matter anti-police stuff I believe that the progressives, because they have control in D.C., they're looking for a back door to have control of local police departments. And they want that control because there's the fear that police departments are not going to exert their will. I would point out New York City, Mayor de Blasio, the friction he has with the New York City Police Department. That's a perfect sign of it. There's always the fear that they're not going to exert the will of the mayor. And they want that.
Okay. Antidem.
Well, what can a poor boy do except to sing in a rock and roll band? Because you see, me in Chicago, there's just no other place for a street fighting man. That song's been sort of playing in my head through the last 2 days because really the left thinks that it's 1968 all over again, and they're going to go up like they did with Mayor Daley and, cause some problems in the streets. And you know what? Maybe they're right, but then again, who won the presidential election in 68?
That was Nixon.
Yeah, exactly.
I didn't want to say it, but I thought it was Nixon. Yeah.
This is what happened yesterday is it's probably going to backfire on them because their aim is the destruction of Middle America, but it's not quite dead yet. And, overconfidence is what kills many an army. It is what snatches defeat from the jaws of victory. And the way this looks, I can't tell you how many people who have gotten some manner or another of red-pilled. You ask them, what did it? It was Trayvon Martin, it was Ferguson, it was Baltimore, and this is yet another thing added to that pile. And Middle America looks at that and goes, no fucking way. And it says, whoever these guys hate, I think I like them. And that's what got Nixon into power. Nixon swept into power on basically anti-hippie sentiment.
Law and order.
Yeah, law and order. We are not going to have people, tearing things up in our streets. And Trump very much has the opportunity to do the same thing. And I think he's smart enough to capitalize on it. And it's shocking how much the other Republican candidates are not. Them coming out with basically anti-Trump statements after this you know, this is, again, in a way, it's the left being overconfident. For years, the Republican Party has been this cucked, defanged, limp-wristed excuse for an opposition party, an incredibly ineffectual opposition party. And the problem is, if you make your opposition ineffectual enough, they will get to the point where they're so ineffectual that they are unable to stop a populist challenge from within. And that's what I think is happening with Trump is, a more competent Republican Party, ironically, would have been able to stop Trump before now. But they are so cucked that they can't even put down this internal challenge.
I'd add to that to fit into the Weimar parallels is the media being completely one-sided against Trump. And, forget the fact that they give him screen time. People who are anti-Trump go, well, he's always on TV. Well, yeah, half the time he's on TV, they're saying he's Hitler or a KKK man or, whatever they want to come up with, a con man. When you look at Weimar journalism, it did not matter how much, and it wasn't just the Nazis, because right before the Nazis took power, there was a right-wing government in force. Now, a right-wing government was collecting 25, 30% of the vote, could cobble together a coalition. The Nazis cracked 40%, which historians look back and they go, well, the Nazis never got 50% of the vote. That's true. But when you look at the Nazis with the elections, they actually had the highest percentages for during their two, you could say, wins. They had the highest percentages for a party in any of the Weimar elections. They were the only party to crack 40%. And despite this, despite the groundswell of support, despite the fact that the country was still voting, 50, 60% right wing, the left wing press in Berlin and in the cities was still talking the straight, what we would call progressive, but that straight progressive line, still harping for, pushing deviancies, pushing social safety net, still anti-right wing. They would not give it up. And that's something that you're seeing here, where it's the same thing, that the media will not even consider what his voters are reacting to. And I will actually give credit. I make fun of him all the time, but Matt Yglesias for Vox, he wrote an article and he said, this is why Trump is winning on the right. And he pointed out all the things that the GOP had just, not paid attention to the last 25, 30 years. And he said it speaks to these voters, and he's pulling voters also from the center. And nobody on the right wing ever wants to look. Actually, I'll take that back. Michael Doherty has tried to look at the grievances from those folks, but nobody else ever looks and says, you know what, there's a legitimate concern from these folks. And that's because, as you mentioned, the cucked right, that GOPE, they are the outer party. They will do whatever the inner party wants. And this is all about open borders.
What's odd to me is the number of times that I have heard, and it's not a huge amount of times, but it's way more than I would expect, which would be basically zero. The number of times I've heard someone say, I'm a Bernie Sanders supporter, but if Bernie doesn't get the Democratic nomination, I'm going to vote for Trump.
Agreed.
Just as this, being against the system, being against the insiders. Now, as for the press, to paraphrase a famous quote, in the future, everyone will be Hitler for 15 minutes. Well, I remember in the first Gulf War when Saddam Hussein was Hitler, then Slobodan Milosevic was Hitler, Reagan was Hitler, Bush the first was Hitler, Bush the second was Hitler, but Bush the second called Saddam Hitler again. The problem with Trump is Hitler is the old, if everything is X, then nothing is X. Literally everything is racist. Literally everyone is Hitler, which makes it meaningless. And it's finally getting to a point where the majority of people are getting to the point where that just doesn't mean anything to them anymore.
Well, yeah. Again, I'm just enjoying listening to the two of you. Well, Ryan, is there anything else that you'd like to add to this?
Yeah, actually, I want to ask you a question. As a British citizen, what is your perspective on? There seems to be that there's the fight, and now enough people have caught on that the fight in that post Cold War era of globalization. The fight right now is nationalism versus globalization, and it seems that in Europe there are multiple parties that talk a nationalist line. Do you see the EU project? Do you see that lasting to 2020?
Yes, but not 2030.
Okay, so you see it like a 15-year expiration date?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't want to be as adventurous as to say that it's going to be over in 4 years, but I would be surprised if it lasted 15 years. In fact, to be honest, I'd be surprised if it lasted 10 years. I think we are. I really do think that we're heading into a new era. Not a good one, not a happy era. It's going to be chaotic. I think this is true also in America. And the nationalist parties that you mentioned, I don't think they're going to be elected, because the public are too comfortable and they're too deluded, and they want the comfort of their delusions too much. They're not going to wake up or do the responsible thing and vote for nationalist parties. These nationalist parties are a symptom of what's going on, of the undercurrents, but they're not going to be selected as the channel by which to resolve these conflicts. They're because they're kind of too embarrassing, they're too obvious, and people will shy away from that for as long as possible. So what instead will be selected as the channel for resolving these conflicts will be civil war. I think that will be selected by both sides, the Muslims and the Europeans, and that's what I think is coming.
One thing that because when I look at Europe, when I look at America, it's like I know people point out the problems in European demographics, and the average age in different countries is high, but so many of the nations are still 80-90% native, if you will, whereas in America it's much lower. But I view it as still there's the deluded European or deluded American. We could actually say deluded Westerner. There's the deluded Westerner, the refugees welcome crowd, and then they're your nativist crowd. And then there's some folks in the middle. And
yeah, most people are in the middle, and they're in the middle because they just don't want to think about it.
And I agree with you that I think people are too comfortable, and that's where I see when I think out timelines. I view our first problem will be like a financial problem, and then a financial problem is going to cause a debate amongst people where it's going to be do you pull the plug on grandma and grandpa in the hospital? Or do you fund, Shaniqua, or I don't know what names in Europe you use for your immigrants?
I don't want to cut you short, but I don't think that this is going to play out this way in Europe. I can see that happening in America. The collapse is going to be precipitated by economic disruption or decline. I don't think it's going to happen. It might happen that way in Europe, but I think a far more likely trigger is going to be Muslims doing something crazy. I mean, they're going to do something.
What's the scale of crazy? Because I view what happened in Paris as crazy, and I would hope that the French authorities would be going door to door, kicking people out, but they're not. So what scale does it have to be?
Bigger than Paris. And,
but again,
yeah, but hold on. I mean, I've discussed this on the channel quite. I did a video called Cologne Quran, where I analysed why is it that the Cologne incident is getting far, far more attention and thought than the Paris attack, and why it's getting more attention and thought than Rotherham. So, and that's interesting. I mean, I think it's telling that the word Cologne is still in the news now. It's still in people's consciousness, And so basically what I'm saying is, I think if things like that keep happening, if we have another 2 incidents like Cologne, I think we're going to be in civil war.
Well, certainly things as they aren't going to fix themselves, because, again, the left rewards malefactors. The Paris attacks happened because we just didn't tolerate Muslims enough. We just didn't understand them enough. We just weren't welcoming enough. Same with Cologne. That's never going to change. They are never, ever, ever going to change their tune on things like that. So, again, going back to what I was saying at the beginning of all of this, it is when the quote unquote responsible parties won't do what needs to be done that it makes either civil war or the next Hitler inevitable.
Okay. Yeah, and I completely agree with you. Hold on a minute, there's a wee technical issue there. Yeah, I agree but nobody in Europe is doing what is necessary. On the contrary, they're doing everything to make it worse. It's amazing. I mean, there's a huge debate to be had about whether they're doing this deliberately.
I think, look, I can't look at the last 100-ish years of the West's history since World War I broke out. Especially as a religious person, I can't look at that and not literally see the hand of the devil in it. And I don't think you can understand the left unless you understand, it is literally satanic. It literally exists to tear down everything good and decent and productive in the world, no matter what the things that it says on the surface are. And it'll tear down the Christian religion. It'll tear down the white race. It'll tear down Europe. It'll tear down everything good, and it won't stop until it is stopped or until it does destroy everything.
I completely agree. And something Ryan said earlier, a few minutes ago, was that we are still largely native in Europe. But that is true. Someone in the text chat says that in Britain we're 87% white still, which is nice. It's really good. But of course, you have to look at the younger generations. And I know that in London, and I've said this many times on the channel, in London, central London, whites are only 20% of the school kids. And the other 80% are non-native. And of course, that's London. It's not the whole of Britain. But this is indicative. And as you say, Auntie Dan, the left are never going to give up. They're never going to give up until it's 0% native in London. And then they'll turn to the rest of the country, and they won't give up until it's 0% native in the whole of Britain. They will. I really do believe that they'll go as far as they possibly can. They have nothing but utter hatred for us. And you can talk about whether they would actually. It depends which leftists you're talking about. Obviously, the champagne socialists will always want their comforts. They'll always want their white retreats. But I think the left in general, as a social force, is entropy. It's destruction. So I completely agree with Auntie Dem there. Okay, so I think probably time to wrap this up. Ryan, is there anything you'd like to say that you haven't said already?
No, thank you. Thank you very much for coming. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, we should do another one. I've enjoyed this. And it's nice to have Auntie Dem here as well. I think it was a nice dynamic. So, okay.
And everyone remember, Beldandy is my waifu and she is queen and your waifu is shit.
Okay. All right.
Speaking over my head, man.
All right. Well, thanks to both of you for taking part, and thanks to the audience for listening. Bye-bye.